Lights, camera, action. Words everyone dreams of hearing while staying on their very own set under the bright, big lights of beautiful Hollywood. Today on Talk Anything, we're rolling out our own red carpet as we dive into the world of movies. Last episode, I mentioned we'd be talking about music, and we will. That episode's coming very soon, but today we're starting with movies. When we talk about movie classics in this episode, we're not talking about obscure film history or critic favorites. We mean the movies that feel like shared childhood or cultural experiences. Early Disney films, The Karate Kid, that kind of thing. But as always, let's jump into the history first. It's worth touching briefly on how movie classics became such a shared thing in the first place. Movies didn't start as something you watch alone, they were communal. Going to the cinema was an event, and later, television and home video meant the same films were being played again and again. For me personally, my classics are Toy Story or Meet the Robinsons. Over time, certain movies became cultural shortcuts. You didn't just watch them, you shared them. And studios like Disney played a huge role in shaping what childhood movies looked like for generations. But that also means if you didn't grow up with access to those films or they weren't part of your household, you could miss them entirely. And that's where today's conversation really starts. So, for today, my guests are fellow TAFE media classmates Adam and Sterling. Welcome, my friends.
Hello. Hi.
Okay, so you know what? We'll get straight into it. In regards to the type of movies we're going to be talking about, why don't you both tell us briefly if or what type of movies that you watch? Why don't you start?
So yeah, I watch some action movies, thriller movies. I don't mind biopics. I do think you have to get a biopic right for it to be the right one though, to be a good one. So for example, Bohemian Rhapsody and Straight Outta Compton, I think, are my two favorite biopics, but I'm hoping the Jackson biopic that comes out this year is also a hit.
Well, there you go. What about you, Sterling?
Well, I don't watch nearly as many movies as Adam over here. However, I do have a few select favorites. For some reason, I watched a lot of 1980s Russian films and a few other sort of unusual, lesser-known films that are kind of cult classics that I enjoy. Donnie Darko is one of those.
Oh, that'll be interesting to talk about more. Okay, so the whole point of this episode is to talk about, whether or not classics are shared, cultural, or personal. So when someone references a movie you haven't seen, do you, ask about it, or do you just nod along like, yes, I've seen this movie? Sterling, what we start with you?
I mean, when someone's talking about a movie I haven't seen, I usually just assume that it's trash because I haven't seen it, which is not a good outlook to have on life, and I realize that. But I don't say that I've seen it. I'll say, no, I haven't seen that, but I don't have any intention of actually going to see it.
All right, so you just keep, your personal preferences about whatever movie you haven't seen to yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't follow along a lot of new movies. I have a pretty low expectation for most Hollywood movies these days, so that probably influences it.
Fair. What about you, Adam?
So when someone tells me about a movie or references a movie that I haven't seen before, I actually get a bit intrigued, and I actually wonder what that movie is. And first thing I do, I don't care if it's good or not, but I just look at the reviews on Rotten Tomatoes to see what people think about it.
Oh yeah.
And then I will find out how to watch it. And if it's not great, it's not great. But it's always good to. Because there's always those movies that you probably haven't seen that you don't think are good but are really good. And I do encourage you both that you do watch some of those movies that maybe you haven't seen, but you should definitely watch them even if you don't think they're good, because they can be really good.
So I'm guessing you're a big movie guy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. I love movies. It's my favorite thing when I'm at home. I like to watch them.
Well, that's always nice.
Said that like a serial killer.
He really did, didn't he?
When I'm at home, I like to watch them. The movies.
But hey, we don't judge here. We don't judge. So, has there... Okay, sorry. Do you think the idea of classics changed depending on where you grow up? And Adam, you got an answer, so let's
Yeah,
answer it.
definitely. For me, I think a classic is anything pre-1980, I think. Because that's usually where, it was in the 80s where we started to see some more CGI compared to what we saw in the 70s. And it's really when that modern technology took over in the 80s and the 90s, and then we eventually got animated films in the late 90s and the early 2000s, like Toy Story, and we got Cars, and we got...
Now, Toy Story is my favourite classic.
I wouldn't really call it a classic, though, but, well, if you're talking about animated movies, it's definitely a classic.
I think part of what makes a classic so hard to define is whether we're talking about a classic as in a period in film history, in which case it could be, anything prior to 1950 or something like that, which is really quite an abstract way of looking at it. It's just looking at it as a period in film history, or whether we're looking at classics as a cultural phenomena and as a thing that concisely defined a genre. In my opinion, what a classic is a film that defines a genre, or a film that, did something new, made a big splash in the film world. And that is how I would consider a classic. And so by that logic, Toy Story is one of the first feature-length CGI animated films, would be considered a classic because it was so monumental to the genre of 3D kids animated movies.
I have to say, I agree with both your points there. I really do. And I mean, the 1980 films, they are... Well, you just can't go wrong with them.
Definitely. You really can't. I mean, you got the beginning... What? You got Commando, you got Kindergarten Cop.
Oh, Kindergarten
And
Cop.
literally any... Like, that's really when Arnold Schwarzenegger was really beginning his arc, and especially when he was in, Alien vs. Predator.
Let's not forget Terminator.
Yeah, definitely. You can't forget Terminator. I mean,
exactly.
I think there's a bit of survivorship bias to it as well, because when you look back at films before a certain date, only the really influential films remain in the public consciousness, and that's why you'd say films before 1980s are classics, but you're really only remembering the films from the 1980s that became classics. Whereas I don't think, there are a lot of B movies and a lot of movies which we wouldn't consider classics today that were made in that era that we don't remember because of that. And so I think another aspect of a classic film is that there has to be a certain amount of time between today and that film in order to see if it really shines over time.
You know what? I do agree with that, yeah. All right, so I'll move on to my next question. If you watched one of these movies now, do you think it would still land the same way? So, I mean, like, for example, Toy Story. When that was first released, it was a big notion in the animation movie world. Do you think it still lands that same way when you watch Toy Story? Or if you've watched Toy Story? Yes, I'm looking at you, Sterling.
I haven't seen Toy Story.
Oh, wow. But I would say, for me, I think the feeling's a bit different because I know how the movie goes. And also, I'm used to watching movies that have a runtime of about 2 hours, and Toy Story only has a runtime of about 80 minutes. So it's definitely different. Kids' movies are a lot shorter than, like PG-13 and MA and R movies. Like, they're definitely longer, they're deeper, and they get you... They are, though, very hit and miss. I do think they are a big hit and miss at times, and you'll probably know if they're a hit or a miss after the first hour because
True.
it's probably not entertaining.
Yeah.
And I definitely think that as well with the certain genres. With the thriller genre, I think the best classic, and this is probably an unpopular opinion if you don't agree with me, I'd say The Shining is probably the best thriller classic out there.
Now, you see, that's the thing. That's where I differ because I don't do horror movies. I find them either boring, fake, or and I'm not ashamed to admit this, too scary. So I
could
have to
come in-
disagree with that.
If I could come in defense of the horror genre, I would like to state that I feel like a lot of slasher films and horror movies, like, people think they're very formulaic because a lot of them are, and they don't have a lot of depth to them. But when you get into more psychological thrillers and more complex and unsettling horror stories that aren't necessarily just slasher flicks, I feel like horror is an incredibly important genre, especially in today's modern world where everyone thinks things are a bit shit. I think horror is a good way of exploring that.
You know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, I do have to agree with you both on that because if I think back to a movie that me and my mother watched recently, it was of Nurse Ratched. And if you don't know the story, Nurse Ratched was it's a long story, so I won't go into detail. But it wasn't a, what was the term that you used, Sterling?
Psychological?
It was that, but it
Thriller?
wasn't
Psychological horror?
a slasher.
Slasher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't a slasher. But it was like a psychological thriller, which I have to say, me and my mother really were both creeped out and enjoyed watching.
I will say this to your point. There's a huge difference between between thrillers and horrors. Horror movies are more focused on fear, dread, and shock. With supernatural elements. Like gore and terror. But thrillers give suspense. Like what Alfred Hitchcock said when making a movie. In a scene, there's a ticking time bomb. And it's just a moment of time before that bomb goes off, which is where all the events, come out. And with lots of these horror movies, like even the modern day thrillers, like Drop, The Housemaid, Send Help, that time bomb goes off at a specific moment, and we get to see all the events that led up to this, and then who the actual bad person is of the movie. A lot of the time it's definitely a surprise, a shock to a lot of people, and certainly there can be a bit of a horror aspect in there, but not a lot, I would say.
Fair. Well, okay, I'll keep it to one final question because we are running out of time. But do you think streaming has changed what we even call a classic?
Yes, definitely. I think
Whoa, that was straight ahead.
the world of streaming has a lot of people thinking a classic is anything pre-2000. To that, I say you are a blithering idiot. In what world is a movie pre-2000 a classic? Like, because movies that are only 30 years old are not even really, in film history, they're not that old. Like, even 40 years old, they're not that old in film history. They still possess a lot of the techniques that we use in today's filming, or CGI, editing, all that sort of stuff. And and a lot of those actors, like some of those actors who were acting in the 80s and the 90s are still acting today in big movies. Like what? I know Christian Bale, he was like probably the early 2000s with American Psycho.
Yeah.
But still, he's still acting today. And I mean, his movie The Bride came out yesterday, and I think I'm eager to watch that and see what that comes towards. Like, it's a bit of a Frankenstein movie, so I want to see what that sort of compels to with the older Frankenstein type of movies. See if it upholds to them or if it just lets it down.
Fair. Do you have a input, Sterling?
Yeah, once again, I think the important definition of a classic is that it's a defining, movie for its medium, for its genre, and that enough time has passed for it to hold up as a classic. And I think how much time needs to pass is a contentious issue, because I don't think it's important to look at it as a sort of percentage of how long film history has been going on for, because by that logic, if we go 30 years is only a drop in the ocean in film history. Well, as time progresses, these timescales are going to get longer and longer. So
Yeah, I mean, we also got to take into account the ever-growing rate that technology is becoming more advanced.
and there are so many more movies produced today that I feel like it sort of accelerated the process where if something is a classic, it becomes a classic a lot faster than it did back in the day because there are just so many more movies for it to stand out against. And I feel like a couple of decades is at least a long enough time to determine whether or not a movie is a classic for a certain genre.
I will say this as well. Yes, those movies pre-2000 will become classics in probably, I'd say, 30, 40 years, something like that. I think a classic should be something that, I think a classic is something that's at least 40, 50 years old. And to sit, and for also cinema goers out there, I don't think, with how technology's changing, like, remember when 3D became a big thing about 15 years ago?
No, true.
Now we got 4D cinemas. We got 4D cinemas.
Sorry, there's a thing called 4D cinemas.
Yeah.
I think it moves the seats, doesn't
Move the seats and you get some, splashes some water at you and scenes like that. It makes you feel like you're in the movie.
Oh, that sounds like a nightmare for me.
Yeah,
I would not like that.
It was a big thing when Top Gun Maverick came out a few years ago.
Okay,
and
that makes sense.
I think there's an event's bringing out a new 270-degree view where you'll be able to see everything in a 270-degree view.
I did hear about that, yes.
So it brings a new perspective as to what because now it brings a new perspective as to you and it makes you feel like you're the character. So, now cinema is becoming more and more advanced where when it went from you just watching a movie in a big theater, now it's becoming a thing where you're becoming the character in the movie.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess that doesn't always hurt. Well, look, you guys had some really... Oh, Sterling, you got a point here?
I would like to say that I feel like the era of big blockbuster Hollywood movies is sort of winding to an end.
Why so?
I feel like a lot of people are becoming disenchanted with, the establishment in terms of movie production because every movie, they're all very similar. They're coming out with similar themes, similar production because they're all, the same establishment movie makers that have been around for decades.
Good point.
And I feel like especially you still need to watch it, but Iron Lung has shown that there is a backlash towards traditional filmmaking techniques as well as, other things I've seen in the indie animation sphere where we've had, new projects coming up which have been trashing Disney. I think it's a real rebirth for less big studio-oriented filmmaking, and I feel like we're going to see more of an interest in smaller filmmakers in the next coming decades.
That'll be... I have to say, I don't disagree with what you're saying, and it'll be interesting to watch what happens with that. Well, look, fellas, I thank you both. This has been really enjoyable and insightful. I hope you have enjoyed yourself as well. As we come to the end of today's episode, I have thanked my guests because this conversation has been really insightful. But that brings us to the end of episode 2 of Talk Anything. If you'd like to keep the conversation going, you can follow us on Instagram at TalkAnything Podcast, all one word. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.